Well, thanks everyone for joining us. This is a very interesting topic, and we're going to talk about AM radio. It's being pulled from some automobiles lately, and it's raising questions. What does that mean for future of AM, future of other radio, FM, radio in general? This is actually a conversation that started a couple weeks ago on Radio for People, and we have two people from that group joining us. We have Michael Brown, who's an engineer, and he runs Brown Broadcasting Services, and also Michelle Bradley, who's an LPM Advocate. Sorry, I heard my voice coming from somewhere. LPFM Advocate, and she's also the founder and manager of REC Services. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Michi? I know you do a lot of things.
I'm basically the national regulatory advocate for low power FM, and these days, small and big non-commercial stations that are not NPR. So we have a lot in our wheelhouse right now. Yes, and you are someone that is great to have in your corner. And we're happy to have you here. And you guys are I thought it'd be nice if you could start us off kind of how you, yes.
Stephanie, before you get them started, let's also acknowledge Tim Russo.
Yeah, I'm also gonna acknowledge Tim. I'm just gonna.
Okay, sorry. I'll stay out of it. I'll mute myself.
Okay. Michi and Michael, if you could give some background like you did in the Radio for People meeting and the different aspects that come up with this issue. And then later on, we'll also go to Tim Russo, who's the manager of KGNU in Boulder, Colorado. He has an interesting point of view because his station does FM and AM, and he's been engaging in the bill that has come up with about having AM radios in cars and talking with politicians, and it'll be great to hear what he has to say too. So with that, I'll take it over to Michael and Michi. Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, go ahead and start, Michael. Go ahead, I yield.
This is the decade where, depending on who you believe, is the 100-year or so anniversary of AM radio. Actually, I just found out that KDKA actually began in 1920, broadcasting the presidential results, Warren Harding election. So we have here in Portland, we have the oldest high school station in the country, which just turned 100 years old last month. So it's an old technology that's survived through a lot of generations of advancement. And I cut my teeth on AM radio, and that's all I worked on initially when I first got into the business. So from an emotional standpoint, it's sad to see what's happening, but I think it still has a place, and it may be an opportunity for community radio. And some of these stations are literally being given away, and I can go into that. But running it and the expense of that and the land is an issue, and I have some new things to share in that regard. Some antenna systems that require a lot less real estate that we could go into. But I guess I'm jumping around, but that's kind of an overview.
Yeah, and so basically the original issue is car companies are taking AM radios out of their future automobiles.
Right.
And Ford was amongst the manufacturers that announced it, and then they did a big 180-degree turn and reversed themselves and said, as of the next model year, the AM radios are going to be in all their vehicles. Some of them had already been eliminated, although interestingly, the electric cars in which they had been eliminated they were just disabled with in software. All the electronics was in there. And so if you have a Ford of this model year, this year, that doesn't have AM, you can get it flashed in, so the AM is activated, and they're offering to do that. The other automakers, which include Volkswagen, BMW, Mazda, and Tesla, that said they were going to eliminate car radios either from their electric cars or from all their cars, have, as far as I can tell, have not spoken up and not reversed their previously announced decisions. So we'll see what's happening. AM is disappearing in much of Europe, or at least they're trying to. And so these manufacturers, which are mostly European manufacturing, felt, well, their cars already have dropped AM years ago, and there was little objection. But the US is a different animal, and we all know about the bill. So.
Right,
Yeah.
it's actually a bipartisan bill. That's correct?
And yeah, it's interesting. Ted Cruz is one of the co-sponsors. It's and we know the motivations of those on the right is that is right-wing talk radio. Actually, in some circles, is credited with saving AM radio, and so their buddies would like to continue to have that platform. But increasingly, it's AM in some ways is becoming what FM was in its very early days: niche formats, foreign language formats, and that's fine. There's a place for that.
Michael, some of us don't know what the bill is. Could you just summarize it?
It's the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act of 2023, and it actually mandates that every car have a working AM radio. Interestingly,
Every car that's manufactured and
For
or
sale
imported
in
into
the
the United
US.
States.
yeah, for sale in the
Yeah.
US. Yeah, well, obviously you only have jurisdiction of what's sold here.
Right, but I'm just saying is it's not going to force somebody who has maybe a car from 1986 when they had the option, you could buy an AM radio only in the car as an option, that they're going to force them to install, or they only have an FM radio in the car for whatever reason, they're going to force them to go into AM. I'm just saying it's for new vehicles
Right.
that are sold or manufactured, that are imported or sold in, made in the United States.
Well, I'm old enough to remember a time when a radio of any kind was not standard equipment necessarily. You could order a car; it was extra money. Your car did not come standard with may not have come standard with any kind of radio. Of course, that by the late 70s that changed. Actually, by the early 70s, pretty much every car had a radio in it. But
Did you have something to add, David?
I have a question. Has a non-safety element of a vehicle ever been mandated by Congress before?
The problem is, if in these proceedings, and this is where I had some issues with the way the legislation is being promoted. They are promoting this as a public safety legislation. They're claiming that the AM radio is a piece of safety equipment.
Oh, interesting.
Because of the PEP system, because of primary entry point.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily directly intended for direct listeners, but is instead intended
to good point.
The rest of the emergency alert system. And when I was watching the hearings on this, I was just shrieking because it's like, you guys have got this all wrong.
Yeah.
Now there are a couple very interesting, there's one interesting caveat also in the bill that got me too, was there's a little loophole in the rule. There's a little loophole in the law that says that if in order to meet the requirement, an option for automakers, and I think I'm calling this the Tesla loophole, is that you can put an AM receiver in there that only receives HD radio. So therefore, only the HD stations, the stations that are broadcasting in AM hybrid, would be, and also like the one out here, the gamut here in DC, which is doing HD only, they would be the only stations that the car would be able to pick up, because it would not have the analog tuning hardware in there. It would just be the digital tuning. And the problem, of course, that we see with this is those of us who remember the late part of the 2000s, and remembering when all the AM stations started to turn on their HD hybrid at night, and what a disaster it became, especially for the small stations that were on first adjacent frequencies, 10 kilohertz up or down. It was a disaster because of the noise, because the system, the AM HD system, I'm talking about the hybrid system only, is garbage. It doesn't work. And especially at night, it tears up the band for many miles to come. And my main issue with the legislation is the Tesla loophole. I really don't think it should be in there. And also, I think the legislation should be extended to require FM as well as AM radios in cars. If this is such a safety feature, FM is going to be next. And I think the writing is on the wall. You look at the sweetheart deals that these car manufacturers have with SiriusXM, that they have with Spotify, that they have with Pandora, and all these icons that show up on a modern day dashboard, and you got to dig to find that AM radio or even FM. It's a joke. And, so I mean, I support the legislation, but I don't think it goes far enough.
Davine, you are nodding your head. I see you have a question or comment. Oh, you need to unmute.
You're muted.
There
you go.
Because of Michi, my windows all at the top and the overhead menu is blocking it. So because of Michi, I got interviewed by Radio World magazine, and they did a test of HD, what they call it hijacking here in Radio World, where all of the information from a nearby 1037, which is our call number, covers the screen of my car, but our station is playing. And that's because they're HD radio. So they're hijacking.
Oh, that's HD FM. That's a different subject altogether. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's a different subject because you just said it's coming for FM. I mean,
I think here's the thing. Here's the thing. For the AM elimination, what Tesla and the other EV manufacturers are saying is that because of the frequencies on AM being, way down in medium wave, they are more vulnerable to electrical noise and interference from the EV systems. And that's the reason why they didn't include AM. However, HD on AM is in some ways able to supposedly work better under a more noisy condition. The way AM HD works is a lot different than the way FM HD works. So that's their excuse. But like, I know I'm fear mongering a little bit here, and I do admit to fear mongering a little bit, but the writing is on the wall that the car manufacturers could take out the FM receiver hardware if they wanted to, and just sell a car that only has streaming services in it. And then, of course, they'll charge you a subscription for it.
Well, that's what they want. They want to do subscription on your heated seats, your heated steering wheel, and your entertainment coming in. They want those subscriptions. That's
Audi already does
what they're
it.
after.
Yeah, Audi.
I didn't know you could
does
get a subscription on a heated seat.
They're working towards it. They're going towards it.
Really? How does that even? I don't get it.
if you would like your heated seat in the future, you're going to have to pay for it on a subscription.
Okay.
Yeah, the hardware, they put the hardware in there, but the computer blocks out the access to it. I mean, somebody could probably come up with a great hack to make it work, but as
Holy
far as
cow, that's
what comes
crazy.
from the factory, this is the way of the future. I mean, Tesla, almost every feature on that vehicle is a subscription.
Wow. All right. That's a
It's
whole
a la
other.
carte pricing.
Why, you ask? Because they can.
Oh
You know,
my
in the old
God.
days of cars that were mechanical things, not electronic things, they didn't have a way to do that. The only subscription you currently pay is fuel.
Right. Right. That's where the money is, subscription.
Mm.
I
Wow.
could see where the subscription for AM or FM could be asked if it was in the contract of sale. But if you purchase it and it comes with it, it should be made available by the car producer to continue to be received rather than cutting it off. I think they got some legal haggles coming up.
Well, and see, the car manufacturer could just completely ignore putting the putting the RF equipment in there, the receiver
Mhm.
equipment in there.
Mhm.
They don't need that extra hardware in there. And if they can get out of doing that, then that's the case. Now, if anything, with one redemption on that with the AM rule is since they're going to be putting hardware in, they might as well keep the FM in there too. So, the AM Act, the way it's worded right now, will probably work to save FM in cars.
It seems to me this is a follow the money issue. Who's making money on it or saving money in one perspective, and another perspective is if it's going to be limited to particular groups that have particular beliefs, and those are all that you can get for free. It's advanced Trumpism. We don't use that word very much in our house. We have some slang that's much more appropriate.
I don't know about that.
What is it?
Wow.
But
Remember, you're being recorded.
Put in the chat, put it in the chat.
This is, well, it's feces head is the legal name.
Yeah, well, we have our own names for DJT over here, and we'll just leave them over here.
Are there any more thoughts on AM as a safety? I know that's a big argument for why it's included.
Well,
Any more thoughts on that
it's a
topic?
valid one, although the question comes, what do you do in between emergencies? It is true that a Katrina, right after Katrina happened, all of the AM and FM stations initially in New Orleans were off the air, all of them. And the only station that was providing emergency information that people in New Orleans could pick up was a 50 kilowatt AM station in Baton Rouge up the highway. And if it was FM, it probably wouldn't have gotten there very well. So it's happened, and it's a valid concern. Of course.
Yeah, and in defense of yeah, and in defense of that too, is the one consideration for overall is that the designated PEP stations across the country are all hardened. They are all well built. Their construction of their locations was funded by FEMA. And so they are, these are buildings that are intended to withstand a nuclear attack. So, if they can withstand the bomb, they should be able to withstand a hurricane.
And if any of you have ever been to a big event or a rally and tried to use your cell phone, you'll know that it doesn't work. Unless you're a first responder and have that priority, the
FirstNet.
yeah, I tried to do a text at a big rally and it came through 2 hours later, a text, and voice phone was useless. So broadcasting has something to be said, you know, that unidirectional system.
Mhm.
And so it has a place.
I think AM radio does have a future. Don't, you know, I feel that we have a place here for the possibility of more diversity. I mean, because really AM radio, if you look at the ownership reports for AM stations versus FM stations, you're going to find a lot more diversity in the ownership on the AM side than you would on the FM side. AM stations are more likely to be owned by ethnic minorities, by African Americans, and other and like I said, various ethnic minorities. I think there's a Polish group in Chicago that has a station, and of course, many Asian American groups own stations across the country in the major markets. AM stations have pretty much gone for fire sale prices in some cases, but a lot of that too, as Michael alluded to a little bit, there's issues with land use. The problem is that a lot of these stations, the land is more valuable than the station is, and what's happens is these stations, these towers get taken down, and those areas are developed into tract homes that they can make, that a developer can make a ton of money on. And a lot of these higher powered stations are operating with directional antennas. Now, in the AM world, if your station is directional, then you have to have multiple towers. You have you've gone down the road and you've seen like 200-300 foot towers back to back on each other. That's a directional AM station. And a lot of times when these stations have to move because they lost their land, they may not have room for 4 big towers. And then of course you've got the NIMBYs, you've got the land use issues, you've got the environmental issues, you've got a lot of issues where it comes to constructing new AM towers. And of course, we've got all the 5G paranoia out there. Suddenly people equate a tower to cancer. And that's a hard one to get through people's minds, that we're not talking about microwave frequencies here. But as Michael said, there are some antenna solutions, and probably what we're going to probably see, and we've already seen this, we saw this started happening with the AM revitalization with the translators, is we're starting to see AM radio stations downscale. And what they will do is, if they're a higher powered directional facility, they will reduce down to a single tower non-directional facility with reduced power. And that's what we're starting to see our share of. And then of course, if they move, it also gives them flexibility to move to another tower. AM stations have the ability to diplex, where 2 or more AM stations can operate off the same tower. So there's definitely some options out there for AM radio, and honestly, there's some community options. Myself, I'm still one that still would love to see a low power AM service, and that was something that was pushed back in the mid 2000s after LPFM came along. There was a push to get a low power. There was a small push to get a low power AM service that never picked up any steam. But
so it's a more of an uphill battle to create and maintain an AM station economically, for sure, is what I'm hearing.
I think, and keep in mind, it's a lot easier to run an FM station. And unfortunately, a lot of the folks who really know AM, we're losing them. They're aging out. And, and the FCC doesn't even fully support AM in the same way that they support FM. In AM, if you want to file a modification application or a license application, you know, in FM, we just go into LMS and do it. AM, you still got to do it on paper. And then they put it into the old filing system, CDBS. They have never moved AM radio fully over into LMS. And we don't have a timeline on when that's going to happen.
Okay.
I think the FCC sees that, yeah, there's not a lot of application activity on AM. I mean, there's averages like a few, maybe like half a dozen applications a week that come through CDBS for anything that's engineering related. It's very rare. If anything, we're seeing more license cancellations than we are much anything else. We were going for, we're on right now, we're on a trend for about one a week this year for AM license cancellations. So, you know, the stations are starting to drop out, you know, but the stations that are but in all fairness, the stations that are dropping out are stations that are very small stations. Some of the stations that still couldn't operate at night or had to operate maybe a very low power, like 5 watts at night, which they were barely even heard anywhere. So, you know, it makes sense, but, you know, the AM is dropping off. The ones that are getting that, the translators, the ones with the translators are still chugging along, but they're marketing they're marketing more to their translator than they are to their AM. You listen to those stations, most of the time they only identify the FM frequency. They only identify the AM at the top of the hour because they have to.
I see.
But most of the time they're marketing their liners, their imaging, everything goes around the FM frequency.
Michael, did you look like you had something to add? And then David, and then I'd like to also talk to Tim after that.
Oh, okay. Well, if we had time and if you wanted to hear, I was going to give a little primer on, you know, the amount of land that's needed and some changes in the FCC rules that happened within the last several years, and also some alternatives to tall towers.
Okay.
We want to get into this kind of technical, but
Should we, why don't we start with, go to Tim and then come back to that?
okay.
How about we do that? Tim at KGNU in Boulder has a FM and radio, FM and AM frequency at his station.
Well, hey folks, thanks for having us. I'm not sure if any others here have or operate any AM stations or not. I don't know that there's actually a whole hell of a lot of AM stations that are community stations or community owned. Just ran into the folks from Kingston Radio out in Kingston, New York, and I saw that they do also have an AM. I'm not sure the nature of that. And then our friends here right down the street from us in Boulder, Radio 1190 at CU, University of Colorado, they also have an AM, and then Colorado Public Radio also has an AM that covers Boulder as well. Our AM was a means for KGNU to get into the Denver market back in 2004, 2005. And when that frequency 1390 was initially purchased, with also some consulting and support from public media company. And the reason the station, I wasn't here at that time, chose to go with the AM was to be able to cover a dense urban area that our FM couldn't break into because of first adjacent and protected contours. It didn't allow for our primary FM 88.5 and still doesn't allow for an 88.5 to get further into Denver, even though there's an entire mountain range that separates the actual frequency that's the first adjacent from the city of Denver. So it's kind of a null area. Unfortunately, when KGNU acquired this frequency at an exorbitant cost, over $4 million back in 2004, 2005, and the AM market immediately plunged into a financial disaster and devalued by about 50% within probably 2-3 years of when the station was purchased. In 2016, we were able to apply and acquire through the AM Revitalization Act an FM translator to move a distant translator from Wyoming down into again, densely urban populated Denver. And we finally just this year were able to submit a handful of minor modifications and get it onto a high peak that gives us pretty much a straight shot straight down into Denver. Another station, traditional jazz station, Latino jazz station, KUVO, also acquired a couple years back an FM translator tied to their FM signal in Denver, and is running as an HD2 that frequency, and it's now one of the urban alternative stations that was highly funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I bring that up because with CPB's efforts to pump money into urban alt stations, it's kind of artificially inflated the value of FM translators in some densely populated top markets in the US, which is the case with Denver. So this FM translator that we acquired kind of relatively inexpensively. It's not a great frequency, but it covers a chunk of the urban area, and we've got it attached to our AM. Actually has increased the value of our AM by a few $100,000, even though we only put a few tens of thousands into that translator frequency. So a lot of stations, and I think Michi, you kind of alluded to this, a lot of folks that do have AM use that more as an anchor to load up on FM translators to cover different corridors that are going to drive more listenership to them. And there's some challenges with that as well. Translators are relatively inexpensive to operate, and you can, our experience here in Colorado is you can find tower rent for $200 to $400 a month for an FM translator. You compare that to the cost of either a ground lease or a tower lease for AM on kind of traditional tower, not taking into consideration what Michael might be presenting later on different tactics for some of this. And you're talking kind of a baseline, what we've seen here again in Colorado along the Front Range of probably $30,000 a year, either on tower rent or ground leases. We've recently, over the last 2 years, we're able to negotiate a new kind of ground lease for our tower. We own the tower. We own everything that's on the land, but we don't own the land where the tower is. So we've got a ground lease. But the ground lease is based on what the lessors believe is the value of having the tower on that land. So again, it runs us a little over $30,000 a year to do that. But we were able to negotiate with Educational Media Foundation group, religious station, to co-locate one of their stations in Denver, which was co-located on a Colorado Public Radio site. They moved over to our site, and so we do a sublease of the tower that's subordinate to the ground lease. It's kind of a complicated lease, but it's not uncommon by any means at all. And that is probably one of the few ways that we're able to continue to sustain our AM at the cost of the ground lease, because it's taken about $25,000 a year off of the cost of us leasing that, and then helps us just with the operational side of sustaining the rest of that. And I'll link an article that was done by Chris Alexander of Crawford in Radio World. Some of you may have seen it. There's a couple pieces on there, but it's about the diplexing and what goes into building a diplexer and the engineering and kind of what that looks like. There's some nice photos of our transmitter site there, but this was highlighted in a couple of editions of the engineering supplement of Radio World just over the last few months. We rolled this out in September last year is when we finished the installation over there. If it weren't for that, again, I think it would be very difficult for us to continue to sustain this, especially with how the AM's devalued over time, and there are ongoing operational costs to do this outside of just the ground leases. Now, if you're on a plot of land that you own or acquire outright with an AM tower, then I think it offers a lot of opportunities for stations that might have that type of asset, because you can co-locate not only another AM station, but you can put other translators, your own translator. We're talking about putting a mesh network on the tower itself in exchange for the in-kind IFP service to the station, et cetera, et cetera. We are still running into issues. We don't have line of sight because our Denver site is quite far from our main station, so we can't do a traditional studio transmitter link there. And we've historically run an ISDN line over there, which is another aging and almost obsolete, unmaintained or no longer maintained type of technology. When we moved our Denver studios from their past location over to the new Buell Media Center with Rocky Mountain Public Media and KUVO, can't even get an ISDN line into that building any longer, and it's smack in the center of Denver. It's just obsolete at this point. So we constantly run into issues, and the ISDN is just there as a backup until we get a second ISP onto our AM site so that we can run redundant audio, live audio over IP links to that space. But our main audio feed is now on RTP from our Boulder studios to the AM site. So, there's certainly loads of challenges depending on how a station might acquire this. And I'd caution folks before letting somebody just offload an AM frequency on you, unless you've really thought through what are the financial implications and how are you going to sustain that over the long haul. Because the expenses can rack up pretty quick. And again, both Michael and Michi mentioned this, the technology might still be around for a long time, but the engineers that sustain that probably will not be. If we think it's challenging to find FM engineers at this point, don't even bring up AM engineers. Here in Colorado, there's like one, and just happens to be our volunteer who's helped, maybe there's two, because the Chris Alexander is a good AM engineer as well. But folks are aging, and younger engineers are not trained in AM by any means at all. And we've never run HD, nor have most AMs in our market in this area run HD there. And if you look at some of the reports that have been coming out, of the near 3,000 AM stations, only about 300 of them tops are HD and less, or even HD only stations. That said, in the last year, apparently about 100 stations have applied to go all HD. And that's a different sort of commercial push to go all HD, to have a greater geographic range with that. And it basically implies and presupposes that HD is available in vehicles, because nobody's got HD in their houses, right? Except for a couple of wonky weirdos, to be honest, right? So, these are things to think about. We've actually seen increasing growth on our app in the areas that traditionally were our biggest AM listening areas and are great areas for our FM signal. So digital first is certainly more the wave of the future. That said, and I see your hand there, David, I have been in conversations before that June 6th hearing with the FCC, with all of our Colorado delegation to DC. And the common thing that we heard there from both our senators' offices and our congressional reps' office is that this AM for Everyone Act that Markey, and I linked it in here already, had pushed out, now there's a lot of co-signers on it, is all the legislators, they've heard more about this from more folks more quickly than most other issues that they've dealt with, even some really issues that we would think would be the hottest issues. I was really actually quite surprised that every single office, the one thing that I heard them all say was, we've just heard so much about this so quickly from loads of different angles, all in favor of keeping AM in here. So they may be moving on that sort of a thing. And then the last I would just close with is, in the conversations with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the folks that are going to be running the next generation warning systems in grants that are going to be rolling out over the next couple of months, FEMA has placed an emphasis, and the folks in NGWS are placing an emphasis on the importance of AM as far as emergency alert systems, for many of the same reasons that folks already mentioned, but also because they reach the rural areas. And part of that NGWS grant rollout is really to make sure that there's resiliency and better warning systems for rural and underserved areas that might not be the urban areas. So we'll see how that actually turns in or manifests itself with the limited funds that the CPB is going to be managing for FEMA.
Thank you, Tim. David and Ursula, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, Tim, thanks for your your perspective. It's super valuable to have an actual licensee involved in this conversation. I'm really curious what KGNU's numbers look like on AM.
We don't subscribe to Nielsen Arbitron numbers, so it's a little bit difficult for us. We did do some RRC numbers a few years ago, but it was right at the onset of COVID, so it kind of was just bad timing when we were looking at that. But what we did see is that kind of our peak hours for FM and online were very similar to the peak hours for the AM, and we certainly had listeners there. Like a lot of your stations, is when the AM goes out, we generally hear about it. In general, we've got a lot more people that are listening in the morning times, and then again on the weekends to the AM, and because those are some of our peak listening hours.
Sure.
One of the things that I'm considering and looking at more conversation around is with an effort to do more bilingual and or more Spanish language broadcasting and split signaling with the AM frequency. In particular, what we've seen here in Colorado areas, most of the AM frequencies outside of the primary sort of right-wing talk stations have been gobbled up by Spanish language stations. Entravision has bought a lot of them. So kind of across the spectrum, you've got a lot of Spanish language AM. So those stations would be dramatically, or those communities, right, that tune into those stations would be dramatically impacted by AM being eliminated from cars. Now, how quickly, that's another question. And that's a socioeconomic question, I think, in a lot of ways, and what types of vehicles. But as a lot of people are leasing vehicles, right, they'll be doing that. So we'll see.
And I apologize, I should know this. Does your Denver AM simulcast the Boulder FM right now?
Yeah, we do simulcast, and we rarely do any split signaling right now. We do have some capacity for that, but we haven't done particularly much as far as that goes. But that is certainly an option for stations that would have two stations licensed. One thing to consider, and this is something that I only learned about as I got into battles with the CPB shortly after arriving here, is if you are a CPB station, or if it's a CPB funded station that's considering picking up an AM, and if that AM covers any sort of highly populated urban area, you really want to make sure that it's not going to screw up your eligibility for CPB funding, because they are not going to distinguish with how good the market is at a particular moment. They're just going to see that, hey, that AM in theory covers a population of 2 million people, and so you should be able to draw in, based on their formulas, X amount of community supported finances or population based membership and funding. And that's really not the reality of things. The one thing that's kind of saved us on that front is that they being the CPB, does allow a little clause, because stations need to power down at night to a much more minimal coverage area, that nighttime contour, and that's got a much smaller population count. So they don't count it 1-to-1, but it could jeopardize eligibility for some stations if an AM is covering an urban area that's densely populated.
Thanks. It's a great perspective. Thanks.
Ursula, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, well, I think David asked it. I was curious, Tim, whether the Denver station was a repeater or whether it does its own production, and so whether there's, so you're saying it repeats the Boulder station, it doesn't produce and put content on the Boulder station.
Yeah, so I think there's two things to distinguish. One is having two primary frequencies, our FM frequency and our AM frequency, versus having two different studios. So we've got Boulder studios and we have Denver studios. All of the production from both studios goes out onto both frequencies, right? And we're not doing split signaling
at the same time. So there's only one radio station.
Ostensibly, it's one station. We can split signal, but we haven't done that. We don't have distinct programming from one frequency to the other frequency. So yes, it's ostensibly a repeater as far as that goes, but there is capacity to be able to split that out. But we don't make the distinction.
But sometimes the audio comes from Denver instead of Boulder?
Yeah, that's right. So our Denver studios go live to air anytime we want them to, or anytime that we've got DJs that are hosting shows from Denver. Now, a couple of years back, the FCC eliminated and Michael Michi can tell me what the name of that rule is, but you don't need to have a separate studio,
Main studio
and
rule.
a main studio
Yeah.
rule, right?
Yeah.
And
Michi.
when KGNU acquired the AM, it wasn't just to cover Denver, it was also to garner volunteer support and volunteer involvement from Denver. So having a second studio in Denver, one, it was an FCC requirement, but two, it was desired. And so when we made a move during COVID into new studios, we actually built a second studio there and more office space and whatnot as well. So even if we were to unload the AM at some point, we would continue to hold and host studios in Denver because we've got so much volunteer participation and community participation and production coming from that area.
And are you the manager of both stations?
Yeah, so it's just one structure. So I'm the station manager for Boulder Community Broadcast Association and everything KGNU. And then we've got a Denver program manager who's ostensibly volunteer coordinator and coordinates studio folks in Denver. And now we've got, plenty of staff that either commute or move between both Denver and Boulder and surrounding areas.
Nice. I like that.
Does anyone else have anything to add to, or questions or comments to what Tim said?
Tim, do you find that the diversity you get from having the two communities both doing production, does that make it worth the trouble to have an AM station?
Again, I would separate the AM from the community participation associated with having second studios or satellite studios somewhere else. I think being able to provide the access and support community participation and sort of critical media training and awareness in an urban area like Denver is very important for a station like KGNU. Certainly because there's a more diverse audience and participation from that area. But it also just offers a different perspective, a different set of voices that are very welcome across the areas that we cover with both the FM and the AM. Again, I don't know that I would acquire an AM in the future just to diversify, but I would certainly consider having a satellite studio somewhere that could provide enhanced engagement and training opportunities for younger, more diverse, and other opportunities for different demographics that are going to help grow the listening audience, whether that be digital first or on your primary frequency, if that's an FM. And this is the type of thing. We just acquired a new building in downtown Boulder, so we'll be moving. And a lot of the reason to move back into the center of Boulder from where we are currently is to be close to the high school, be close to the university, be close to downtown, create more visibility, and recognize that a lot of community radios are a lot more than just community radios. We're a community media hub and a training center, and we're a critical asset for the vitality of the arts and culture in the communities that we serve. So making it more accessible and more visible and adding some features to that space that are accessible also to other organizations, nonprofit and arts and cultural organizations, is really critical to our mission overall and the future of the station, especially as younger folks are listening via other means. That said, I think there's a role for AM, right? It's just making AM work for you if you're going to go down that route. And I think that's one of the challenges that KGNU has for ourselves moving forward as well. We've got a wonderful engineer that's very much pro going like all HD on that. And the reality is that our current AM listeners would probably never ever tune in if it was all HD, because they're primarily older folks that do not have that technology in their homes and might not be going out to buy a new Tesla or a new vehicle anytime soon. So you got to make sure that it works. Again, that's where we'd be looking more at, can we or should we be doing more bilingual and or Spanish only programming on the AM, which has the capacity to be able to tap into the fastest growing demographics in our region and provide a service that no other service providing, that's sort of a progressive thinking AM or bilingual format to people.
Michi, I know you have to go soon. Do you have any final thoughts that came to you that you would want to add?
No, I think this was a great conversation. I think this was a good AM 101 for everybody as far as where the current state of AM radio is. You know, any mode is only going to be as good as we can make it. And we got to work with what we've got, and we've got to keep radio relevant. And fighting for AM, even though we may not have a direct vested interest in it, it fulfills a much larger goal that all community broadcasters and all broadcasters in general should have. And that's what I call keeping radio relevant. We need to keep the word radio in the people's minds, because, you know, we have kids today that don't even know what the radio, never listen to the radio. They're too busy on their TikTok and their Pandora. And, you know, we can't, you know, and they're not realizing what radio can do. And of course, influence from the large commercial companies is not helping in radio's reputation. But as soon as somebody turns to the left of the dial, they'll usually discover some really good things down there. And especially with the low power FM window coming up, we have many more opportunities for many more different types of diverse programming and programmers in many different genres, and bringing radio back to the community. That's what we fought for back in 2000 with the creation of LPFM. That fight is still on, and we're still having to fight, especially now that we are in war with the car makers. And you know, because like I said, if they come for AM first, what are they going to come for next? And that will hurt us a lot more if they ever did come for FM, because a lot of us, our lifeblood is FM. And just some things to think about from the Michi as we move forward with this is, you know, we need to make sure that we support any legislation that keeps radio relevant. And it's got the ear of Congress, it's got the ear of the nation. And if this is what it's going to take to, if this is also what it's going to take to bring the parties together on something, hey, I'm for it. So yeah, let's keep this going. We may not be able to directly benefit from it. Maybe KGNU is the exception. But we could definitely, we will definitely benefit in the long run, because we're keeping radio on people's minds and reminding people that radio is still a medium for their community. And that's where we're at. Anyway, in case we don't chat between now and then, we'll see you at the GRC.
Right on. Thank you, Michi. We appreciate you coming. Thank you.
No problem. I just booked my tickets today, and I'm going. So
right on.
I'll see you there.
West Virginia.
All right, I got a hard. I'm sorry. Yep.
West Virginia. Yep.
Well, all right. With that, I say good night from Riverton.
Good night. If you all are able to stay a little longer, I just want to give Michael a chance too to fill in any gaps that were missed or that you thought needed explaining or anything.
Well, as we've discussed, the big reason that AM stations are dying is that the land under their towers ends up being a lot more valuable than the station. And just give some perspective and dimensions and maybe a partial solution. And I'll make this quick because I have to leave here in a few minutes also.
Okay.
Essentially, an acre of land is just very roughly 200 feet by 200 feet. a typical mid or mid-high band AM station, let's say it's at 1,000 or 1,200 or something like that, is going to need about 4 acres of land for a ground system for one tower. Typically the tower heights are at least a quarter wave high, and a quarter wave in the middle of the band is about 250 feet, 280 feet, something like that. And typically the ground radials on the ground system go out about as far as the tower is high. And so you can see it eats up a lot of land real quickly. And of course, if it's a directional station, then you got multiple towers, and that becomes many, many acres of land needed. So a lot of these stations that are being given away or almost given away are more often than not sold as just a raw license, or given away a raw license without the land included. And you've got to find a new home for it. And finding acres of land anywhere in or near an urban area or even a suburban area is difficult. And so if you can reduce that land size, maybe there's a better chance of doing it. So there's been a couple of possibilities. First of all, the AM needs some kind of ground system to work, or it's very inefficient. And the FCC has minimum efficiency standards. The minimum efficiency standards for most classes of AM were actually reduced by about 30% here within the last few years. And so this opens up the possibility of smaller towers or smaller ground systems. One that I've looked at for years and has usually been used for temporary or military installations, but increasingly I think it may be for permanent, is a fiberglass 75 or 85 foot whip antenna made by a company called Valcom. And if I can share, I can show you a picture of what it looks like.
Sure, yeah.
Share screen. Okay. And for now, these are only FCC compliant for frequencies 1,200 and above, although with the reduced efficiency standards, they probably will work down to about 900 and above, so the upper half of the AM band. It's only 75 or 85 feet tall, only requires a ground system about 100, 120 feet out. You can get the hardware for this for about $35,000 or $40,000, including the antenna tuning unit. That's not including the installation, of course. And it tilts up on the base. So the problem in siting new towers is, one, the land, but also two, the height of the tower. Nobody wants a tall tower in their backyard. There are sometimes some FAA considerations. So the shorter you can make the tower, the more likely you'll be able to locate it. So instead of putting up a 150, 250 foot tower, if you can get by with a 75 footer, that really opens up some additional possibilities. And it's fairly affordable. And the efficiency is not as good as a 200 foot tower would be, but it's close. And I think this might be a partial solution. Also, another company, Kintronics, probably the biggest maker of antenna tuning units and phasers in the country, makes something called Kinstar, which relies on basically treated utility poles. And it also is kind of a low profile, although it's not this low. They're typically 100, 150 feet high. And there's a couple of them in Oregon. It hasn't really taken off, but anyway, I just thought I'd throw this out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Has anyone else heard of these antennas? It's all new.
Yeah, well,
Cool.
like I said, the Valcom mast that I showed you has been around for a while, but most of the customers have been military, temporary, and backup antennas. But now it's more viable as a permanent installation. And if the user is willing to sacrifice a little bit of efficiency, a little bit of coverage area, but the plus side is they're actually able to save the station and afford the station, then
Yeah.
something that could be used. So there's one or two cases here in the Portland area. I'm going to introduce this as a possibility to them. Basically, stations that are on STAs and or off the air and are about to die. We've lost 4 or 5 AM stations, a couple of which were 5 kilowatt day and night stations. They weren't little baby stations. They were significant stations with significant nighttime coverage, and they're now gone. Yeah, go ahead. That's it.
I think your point, Michael, about AM is the new FM is an awesome perspective. Like, yeah, this is the way to transmit sort of niche programming,
Yeah.
whether it's traditional minorities or whether it's ethnic minorities or whatever, or just alternative voices on the air. Get more of them.
Yeah, here in Oregon, in the Portland greater metro area, we have, in addition to the usual, a lot of Spanish language. We have at least 2 Russian language and 1 Chinese. And
Oh, cool.
there's talk about having a full-time Korean. There are at least 2 or 3 full-time Korean language AM stations in LA and a couple in San Francisco also. So this it's not just right-wing talk radio or
Yeah, right.
or sports talk. There are foreign language in particular is a strong niche, and many of these stations they're profitable. So and
I appreciate that. Thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions or comments for Michael?
I was just going to reiterate that, what Michael and I think Michi said that as well is, with the AMs is finding a piece of land, even with this whip antenna needing 120 or 112 feet of radius for the radials. Is you want to make sure that property is a piece of property that's not going to go away anytime soon, because developers are, certainly in any urban area, finding there's much more value in developing the land than keeping an array of AM towers on there. So stations are getting pushed out. Even Colorado Public Radio, I keep referencing them. They've got a tremendous broadcast site, like smack in the center of Denver. It's a place called Ruby Hill, where they've got a dilapidated old building and 2 towers on that. And that's where Crawford moved from there to our crappy little antenna site that's completely surrounded by warehouses. And our radios are actually covered by steel warehouses, which are not great for the AM propagation. They never should have been built on top of the radios, but it happened. It happened at some point before I was around, when folks were not really paying a lot of attention. So it's kind of really challenging. And I would expect that probably sometime in the next 10 to 15 years, we'll get a notice from the folks that own the land where our AM site is, saying that they've either sold and that it's going to be developed, or they would just prefer not to have us there because they're going to develop that plot of land. In the meantime, it still means some revenue for them, but they're not even getting the benefit of having the second station on that tower, right? And this was something that we had to negotiate, that we would be able to put a co-located frequency onto our tower without having to get permission or any sort of revenue share with the landlord. Because oftentimes you'll find that the landlord of the ground lease wants a cut of any additional frequencies or anything else that's going to go on to your tower there, which isn't beneficial then to who owns the tower itself.
if you integrate the ground system into the building, it can actually work out okay. KFI in the LA area, they built warehouses and light industrial buildings around the tower. And in each case, that they put the radios up in the walls, over the ceiling, and down the other walls. And it actually works pretty well. It doesn't really degrade the signal much at all. If you don't do that, then yeah. If you just pave it over, like they've done in Honolulu with many of the AM some of the AM stations there are in a parking lot of a shopping center, and they just paved over it, and it messed up the signal. But if it's done right, you can have buildings within about 50 feet of the base of the tower, and it doesn't really materially affect the AM. And with having the ground screen over the top, it cuts down at least on the RF interference in all their computers and telephones. Doesn't eliminate it, but so you can't have the multi-use. Yeah, there's a lot. I don't know how many of you guys have paid attention to what happened with WLW, the one-time 500,000 watt station. There's Cincinnati. They're building a whole commercial park around that now. So.
Oh, wow.
We'll see what happens. I'm a little leery about putting anything near a 50 kilowatt, but for a 5-in-1, I think it's very doable if it's done right. So.
Well, thank you. And David, I saw you posted a picture in the chat.
Yeah, just regarding the value of land, this is a 1,400-foot tower now, it was built as a 1,400-foot tower, and it's not AM. I mean, I doubt that there's any AM stations on it. It's FM, multiple TV stations up at the top, and it was, like I said in the chat, it was built 25 some years ago when that was the outer reaches of the west side of Madison, and now it's just surrounded by commerce and housing communities, and the developers are just like, we want this land.
Oh my God. Well, I want to say thank you everyone for a very thoughtful conversation. This was great. This was awesome. And special thanks to Michi and Michael and Tim for sharing your expertise and experience, sifting through a lot of information here. Everyone was contributing, and it was just great. Thank you so much. I know everyone's time is valuable, and I don't want to keep you. I just want to, for people, if you need to go, that's cool. I want to give Barry a chance to talk about his upcoming talk he's going to give for, I know we have lots of people on YouTube who check in on this too. So Barry has been the host of Radio Curious for years and years, and he's developed a great technique for interviewing, and that's what he's going to talk about. And if you want to add to that, Barry, please do.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Basically, I want to talk about ways of probing a guest for an interview, about what they're thinking, why do they think it, if they use a reference like Timo did a little while ago about services that are community services that are provided by community radio. It jumped out to me as well, what are those services to somebody who may be listening but doesn't know what they are? And then taking a stream from that and say, how could other purposes be included in there that were important to the questioner? A topic that came to my mind that I'm not sure if we can address next week, but taking the role of smartphones, TikTok, Pandora, into a position where we can consider the effect that it has on the forming mind of children and their view of the world, and possibly taking it back to before television, before telephones, the role of the piano that provided community services for the home or for the community, and it still does in some ways. And then talking about radio itself, interview radio is my experience. It's really a one-to-one relationship. somebody driving a car listening to someone else in conversation. And what does that mean? It's not like talking to a large audience or to a small audience as we're doing now. In prep for the program, I would ask that people who plan on being there or would just be curious about it, consider what is the purpose of this interview that I would like to do? What is the information that I would like to gain from being able to interview the person? And then some ideas
And
about.
I was just going to add that you and I talked about we're going to send out an early invite, a pre-invite to have radio station managers tell their producers to come join us, so they can get on this too.
That's a good idea, and maybe that's what people should read rather than more details now. But how to ask probing questions without turning off or insulting the guest is what that comes down to in a few words. And I look forward to being part of it in a month.
Yeah, this is going to be great. I'm looking forward to it too. Thank you, Barry. I'm glad you could join us today. That was fun. Any last words? I'm gonna hit the button. Okay. Thank you everyone for being with us. Have a great rest of your day.